Please.
So I'm Julia Vico. I just introduce myself. We can chat afterwards for those who just came in. Today I will talk about water management for high and stable crop yields. So I will definitely give an agricultural dimension to water damage management today. So if we talk about, just as a general framework, if we talk about food and water, we are basically faced with three global challenges. One is to meet current demands for food, fiber, and biofuels, and this requires not only high yields but also stable yields, and I will get back to that in a second. We need to preserve profitability and at the same time, almost mission impossible, ensure sustainability by managing available resources, water, but also land and soil resources, reduce the negative impacts on the environment, think about reduction in water pollution or emission of greenhouse gases, and possibly also enhance ecosystem services. Now, I was saying about high and stable crop yields. So, the stability of crop yields is one of the three pillars of food security. So, it's an important aspect. The other two being actually access to food and the ability of and safe food. So if we look at the yield variability, it's still relatively high. Here you see a map for maize. You see the coefficient of variation of maize yields across the world. Anything that is yellow reddish, you have more than 30% of standard deviation with respect of the mean. So it's a large variability. Also, some areas up here that are maybe not appearing. I'm thinking about Sweden. Last summer we got a fantastic sunny and dry summer. Unexpected in the region, we got a 30% reduction in yields. That's a massive reduction. And we were also, Sweden was to import, for example, fodder for animals. So it was pretty bad. So there are many factors playing a role in affecting yield stability. As for the case of Sweden, temperature and precipitation are key in many regions. They can explain more than 60% of the variability in yield in most of the productive regions. Now, how do we go about that? How do we stabilize yield? If water is the issue, but also under a certain point of view temperature, irrigation can definitely help in that respect. It has been shown, for example, in data from the US, that it can stabilize yields. But of course, this comes at a cost. We have to manage, we have to have water available and to manage the available water in a proper way. This has implications both locally and globally. I'm sure you're familiar with this. I just wanted to place a bit in context what I will be talking about. There is of course the local dimension, local agricultural practices, farmers' choice in terms of crop, land use, irrigation strategy. They affect the local demands for resources. In particular, we are interested in water today, and they affect yields and yield stability. On the other hand, of course, these aspects affect the local and international trades of commodities, in particular food. If you consider all the linkages, the global demands for food, feed, and fiber, and at the end of the day also the climatic conditions, thus feeding back to the local climatic conditions, back to the choices available to the farmer. Today I will start by talking a bit about the progression from local farmers' choices, crop irrigation, to the demands of water and yield stability, and how they are affected by local adaptive conditions. I will then zoom in on the crop and then finish up by talking a bit of where do we get the water to implement this. And in particular, I will focus on 4 questions. Questions that you will see immediately are key for water management in agricultural systems. First, how crop performs under variable rainfall. Can management, for example irrigation, reduce yield variability and increase yield, and if so, at what cost? What is the best use of land and water for sustainability purposes, but also what is the best use of land and water under the points of view of the farmers? Because here we are faced with issues of basically decision making under uncertainty, if you consider that at the bigger level. Now, to answer to these questions, definitely we need the quantitative methods. And to develop these methods, this is basically these are the nuts and bolts of eco-hydrology. But we need to address a couple of challenges. One is the variability and unpredictability of conditions. I will be focused in particular on precipitations. The second is that if you talk about plants, they respond non-linearly to water availability. This means that a little bit of water stress, not a big deal, probably no effect. Below a certain threshold, you start seeing some effects of lack of water, and then below is another threshold, for example, of soil moisture. The plant will die, you will not see a single gram of yields. So this is an important aspect. The approach I will follow today is basically what I would call a stochastic minimalist model, where I consider the key aspects playing a role here. So I don't want to go too much into the details. The reason for this is that first, I would like to be able to consider explicitly the interannual unpredictability of rainfall on the one hand, and on the other hand, I would like to keep the model as simple as possible, because we need to be able to parameterize the model in a sensible way. So the system I have in mind, imagine a field, your crops, your plants. The rainfall will occur, we don't know when. This will affect the soil moisture in the rooting zone, with down at the bottom here. Every time it rains, there will be an increase in plant water availability, then followed by a dry down, and then another increase. Now, if we consider also irrigation, we might have other inputs here. Here represented, well, the red it's red, but it's black. So represented in black. I'm sorry for the writing, unexpected. You see also increases in soil moisture whenever there is a black bar. That is basically an irrigation application. Now here I consider as as irrigation a demand-based irrigation. So basically, I assume that an irrigation application occurs whenever soil moisture reaches a certain threshold, preset threshold, like an intervention point. And that at every time a certain amount of water is supplied. This means that the amount of water that is supplied at the irrigation application is known. What is not known is when the irrigation occurs. In turn, this has effect on plant biomass, basically on every aspect of plant growth, in particular plant biomass accumulation. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but basically there is plants need to transpire water to fix carbon. So anything that reduces the transpiration by plants, like water, lack of water, will reduce carbon uptake. So this basically means that you can see also whenever there is a reduction in water availability, there will be a reduction in the carbon fixation, a reduction in biomass growth, and so forth. In turn, the biomass at the end of the, basically after flowering, is very well connected to the final yield. Even if you're thinking about like a cereal crop where the marketable yield are the seeds. So rainfall is unpredictable, which means that soil moisture will fluctuate in an unpredictable way. Biomass accumulation will be also unpredictable. This means that we have a collection of variables that needs to be treated as random variables. And I will, to describe them, I will basically now sketch the steps to obtain analytically the probability distribution of these key variables: soil moisture, plant biomass, and water requirements for irrigation. And then basically present several results in terms of averages and standard deviation. So a measure of the average, of course, but also a measure of variability. Now, just a few ideas on how we got those distributions. We started from the soil-water balance. I'm sure this doesn't come to you as a surprise. I hope so, at least. The rate of change of the soil moisture, S, is the result of inputs via rainfall and irrigation, and losses via evapotranspiration, deep percolation, and runoff. Now there are, we can of course look at these under the point numerically, like simply force this balance with the observed rainfall, but we went another way, and we considered the rainfall as occurring like a marked Poisson process with a given average interarrival time and exponentially distributed event depths. Now here the idea, aside from the names, is that it is the interarrival time between two subsequent events are exponentially distributed, so it's more likely that it rains after short intervals than after long intervals, and also the amount of rainfall that comes when it rains is also exponentially distributed. It is more likely that it rains just a bit as opposed to a massive storm. Irrigation is basically what I had described before, an impulsive amount of water that is delivered to the field whenever soil moisture reaches a certain intervention point. With these ingredients and a bit of mathematical massaging if you want, it is possible to obtain analytically the soil moisture probability density function under stochastic steady state. So considering still the variability of soil moisture, but assuming that the probability density function of soil moisture doesn't change in time. All the ingredients, all the key ingredients of our system are embedded in the in this probability density function in terms of rainfall patterns, frequency, average frequency of events, and average depth, irrigation parameters, when you irrigate, how much water you provide, crop features, soil features. This allows to determine how often the system will be, the soil moisture will be below the threshold for reduction in biomass growth. So with this, we can also describe what happens to the accumulation of the plant biomass and thence the final yield. With an extreme simplifications of what happens, we consider the crop biomass as increasing according to a certain speed when conditions are good, when water is plenty, and according to a lower speed, and you see this up here, when soil moisture is lower. Basically, this is equivalent to seeing this as a dichotomous noise, fast, slow, fast, slow, fast, slow. With these simplifications, we were able to obtain the probability density function also of biomass accumulation, biomass after flowering, and hence yield. So, similar ideas, I don't want to go in the details, similar ideas applies to water used for irrigation. You have a certain, as I said, the amount of water supplied at each irrigation application is known. What is not known is how often irrigation occurs. From the soil moisture probability density function, it's possible to describe the interarrival time of irrigation, and then look at the cumulative amount of water applied and its distribution. So, with this, I just sketched the main aspects. We basically can describe the probability density function of soil moisture, crop yield, and water requirements, depending on soil feature, crop features, rainfall parameters, irrigation strategy, and possibly we'll touch this just at the end, water availability for irrigation. How can we use this tool? Well, definitely to study the effects of crops and the rainfall regime on our key variables. Now, I will now show several plots like this. On the x-axis, there is the mean of the variable of interest. In this case, total rainfall over the growing season. On the y-axis, the standard deviation of that variable. And then in each plot, the dots, the size of the dot is proportional to the amount of rainfall over the growing season. So here, mean rainfall, well, increases with mean rainfall, but also with our model, also the variability of rainfall increase, not linearly, but yeah, it increases. Now, if we look at what happens in terms of yield, now mean yield on the x-axis, standard deviation of yield on the y-axis, there is, with increasing rainfall, so increasing size of the dots, and assuming rain-fed agriculture, there is an increase in average yield. But actually, the standard deviation follows a completely different pattern. So there is low standard deviation when the yields are low, at low rainfall input, low standard deviation when rainfall is plentiful, and a maximum of standard deviation in between. If you think about that, it makes absolute perfect sense. If there is no water, there is no water. So there is not much variability. If there is plenty of water, then it doesn't really matter whether there is a variability in rainfall amount. The condition in between, the magic climates, are the most problematic. Now, what happens if we irrigate? As I already kind of hinted at before, irrigation can definitely reduce the variability in yield and increase the average yield. I'm sorry it's not so very apparent here, but if you look at the right there is a kind of a black line which represents the same plot but now for traditional irrigation. You see an increase in yield, in particular at when rainfall is low, not unexpected, and also an overall reduction of the variability in yields. Now, what is the cost of this? The cost is, of course, in terms of water requirements, but also variability in water requirements. So down here, you have the mean required irrigation volume over the growing season, and its standard deviation. Now, the line is this. Rainfall increases now from right to left. If there is a lot of rainfall, no irrigation needed, no variability in the amount of irrigation needed. If there is, if rainfall is very scarce, there is the need for irrigation is high, but the variability is not extreme. Again, under intermediate conditions, you have the highest variability in water requirements. So, if you look at this, there is definitely a trade-off between yield and yield stability and water requirements, but also a trade-off between reducing, on the one hand, reducing the yield variability and increasing the variability in water requirements, which of course causes a problem of management of resources. Now, with these, so far these results basically are all for one crop. I use maize because it's a very water demanding crop and because it is also a crop very sensitive to a reduction in water availability. But what is the role of the crop? I mean, farmers cannot probably play around with rainfall, but they can choose which crop to plant. So the role of the crop is complicated in some way because crops can have different features. They can explore a deeper soil horizon, so have access to more water if the water is there. But they can transpire more or less, so use the water faster or slower. They can also be more or less sensitive to water stress. I was mentioning maize is extremely sensitive to water stress. Now, this means that if we go back to the tool I presented, there will be different distributions of yields and water requirements. So we can see, we can compare what happens with different crops under the point of view of food security and water requirements. Now, I could start playing around a bit and show you some ideas how the maize compares with wheat, for example, or so forth. I will go slightly more, a slightly more radical way. Jumping back on something, a discussion that is ongoing in the agronomy community, and specifically that currently our crops are mostly annual plants. This means that they provide a few ecosystem services. I will say a few words more on this in a second. So, for these reasons, there is an increasing number of people saying, well, we should actually abandon or at least diminish our reliance on annual crops and transition to perennial crops. Why is that? Because they can provide these ecosystem services, in particular because they have more carbon stored in the soil, so they could enhance the carbon sequestration, or at least increase the amount of soil organic carbon, which has positive repercussion, for example, on water holding capacity. By sitting on the field all the year long, they are perennial, so they stay there. They can reduce soil erosion and nutrient leaching. And they have, again, because they are there, they have an edge against weeds. Just to show you a bit of what I'm talking about, I'm thinking about really perennial grain crops. And they are under development. The breeding community is kind of doing their magic. And basically going, here again it's written, but you don't see it, this is a regular wheat plant, Triticum aestivum. This is its perennial relative, Tinotum pirum intermedium. Now, differences are immediately apparent. The perennial plant is bigger in all sorts of ways. It has also a massive amount of roots. Precisely the reason why we can get all those ecosystem services. Now, why aren't we using them then? Well, of course there is a good reason, an extremely good reason why our agriculture is currently based on annual crops. And basically that perennial plants, and in particular perennial crops, tend to produce less. So, a very pragmatic reason why we use annual crops. So, more in general, if we want to compare a perennial plant with an annual plant, this cartoon more or less describes reality. The perennial plant has more roots. It has a bigger biomass, it's bigger, so also more transpiring biomass, if you start thinking about water again. But it produces a lot less seeds. We can put also some numbers out of that on this general pattern. Perennial plants on average have 1.9 times, almost 2 times more root biomass. They lead to a 50% less seed production, and they have about 2.5 more leaves. At least when we look we looked at many pairs to come up with these numbers, but you get the general picture. Now let's look at this for a second under the point of view of water use. More roots. this means deeper roots in most cases. It means access to water resources that are inaccessible to annual plants. So you can look at these as perennial plants having the potential to lead to be less sensitive to water shortage. And so leads to higher productivity under water stress. Good. On the other hand, as I was saying, they produce less seeds also under well water conditions, which means that even under well water conditions, they may have a lowering bed. And then finally, more leaves. If the coupling with the atmosphere is good, this would mean higher transpiration, so faster depletion of the available water, so more frequent water stress, so more frequent reduction of biomass in yield due to water stress. Bad. So we basically don't know what the net result out of this is in terms of water requirements, well, its stability, water requirements, and their stability. We basically employed the same model that I described before to try to come up and understand what's the net result of this going from an annual plant to a perennial plant, with an emphasis on water issues. So now, in this plot, on the x-axis, there is the ratio, now no longer the mean yield, but the ratio of the mean yields for the perennial to the annual. So anything that is below 1, which is here, means that the perennial have lower average than the annual. On the y-axis, the ratio of the standard deviations. So again, perennial to annual. Anything below 1, lower standard deviation for the perennial. And again, we played around with rainfall amount, which is an interesting aspect, of course. You can focus on one of those lines here, the solid one. It has a kind of weird shape, but if you look, it completely exists regardless of the amount of precipitation. It is left to 1 and below 1, which means that the perennials have lower average yields, lower yield variability. So they have a more stable but lower yield. So we are again in the face of a trade-off. When it comes to irrigation, there I assumed a certain aspect, a certain level of irrigation. Again, here you have the ratio of the average water volumes perennial to annual, and their standard deviations, the ratio of the standard deviation. Now anything that is above 1 will mean that the perennial have higher water requirements than the annual. Anything that is above 1 on the y-axis means that the perennial will require a more variable amount of water. So aside from some weird perennials, most of the perennial plants will have higher and more variable water requirements. So under the point of view of water use, we can say that the perennials just a quick summary. The perennial crop has lower average yield, bad. More stable yield, good. More water requirements, bad. And also more variable water requirements, bad again. So they might provide some ecosystem services, the ones that I described in qualitative terms, but a shift in from annuals to perennials have definite implications, not only in terms of yield and yield stability, but also in terms of use of water resources. Of course, if you do that in a field that is big, it will not have much impacts at watershed scale, but if you start thinking about, okay, let's do this extensively, then results will be apparent. Now, the last tiny piece here. I've talked about, I've introduced an approach to quantify yield variability, water requirements and their variability. I discussed a bit what's the effect of crop type with if you want a peculiar example, annual and perennial crops. And now I would like just to use the same tool to look at a bit more on the aspect of water resources and where they come from. Now, I'm basically progressing in space. Up to now, I was thinking about a single field, a single plant almost. Now I'm looking at slightly larger scale, a farm. If you think about just a visual example, imagine that you are in a relatively flat area. Of course, you could get your water for irrigation either from a river nearby, but maybe it's not available, maybe it's not available all the time. You could drill a well and go to the groundwater. Or you